The rust-red sun was sinking behind the Tennessee ridgeline when York stopped dead in his tracks, ears pricked forward, body rigid as steel. Tom Grant had seen that stance before in the mountains of Afghanistan when his German Shepherd partner detected something dangerous hidden in the shadows. But they were home now, or what passed for home, walking the familiar trail through the pine forest near their cabin. York's deep growl rumbled low in his chest, and his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the tree line. Tom followed his gaze and saw it through the gaps in the foliage, a massive silhouette of crumbling concrete and rusted metal towers rising against the darkening sky. The old power plant. Tom had driven past it dozens of times since moving to this isolated corner of East Tennessee, but he had never paid it much attention. Now York was pulling hard against the leash, not in fear, but with purpose. The dog's nostrils flared, processing scents that Tom could never detect, and everything about York's body language told him one thing. Something was wrong at that abandoned plant, something that demanded investigation. Tom felt his pulse quicken. After years of trusting York with his life overseas, he had learned never to ignore the dog's instincts. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Tom Grant was not the man he used to be. The decorated Special Forces veteran had returned from his final deployment 3 years ago, carrying invisible wounds that no medal could heal. His service had taken him to places he could not talk about, where he had done things that still visited him in nightmares. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. He struggled to find purpose in a world that moved too fast and cared too little. His marriage had fallen apart within a year of his return. Friends drifted away, uncomfortable with his long silences and sudden startle responses. He had tried working construction, then security, but nothing felt right. Eventually, he used his savings to buy a small wooden cabin in the mountains near Crossville, Tennessee, seeking isolation and peace. The cabin was modest, just 2 rooms and a porch, but it was his. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. Most days, Tom chopped wood, repaired the old structure, and tried to quiet the chaos in his mind. The only constant in his life, the only thing that kept him tethered to sanity, was York. The German Shepherd had been his military working dog during his last 2 deployments. When Tom left the service, he fought hard to adopt York, who was being retired from active duty. The process took months of paperwork and persistence, but Tom refused to give up. York was not just a dog. He was a brother-in-arms who had saved Tom's life more than once, and who understood him better than any human ever could. Their bond was forged in fire and blood. Tom remembered the night in Kandahar when York detected an IED hidden beneath a false road surface, stopping their convoy just seconds before disaster. He remembered the firefight in a mountain village when York tackled an insurgent who had Tom in his sights, taking a bullet that was meant for his handler. He remembered countless nights in forward operating bases when York would press against him during the mortar attacks, both of them waiting for dawn. That kind of trust could not be broken. Now, in the quiet mountains of Tennessee, they were still a team. York slept beside Tom's bed every night. When the nightmares came, when Tom woke up gasping and drenched in sweat, York was there immediately, nuzzling his hand, grounding him back in reality. They walked the forest trails every morning and evening. York was always alert, always scanning for threats, his training never fully leaving him. Tom found comfort in the dog's presence. York asked for nothing except food, water, and companionship. He did not judge. In York's steady brown eyes, Tom saw acceptance and loyalty so pure, it sometimes brought tears to his eyes. The cabin was isolated, but Tom was never truly alone. The letter had arrived 4 days ago, a thin envelope from Crossville Memorial Care Facility. Tom's uncle, Bernard Grant, was declining rapidly. The staff wrote that Bernie was asking for Tom, saying he had something important to discuss before it was too late. Tom had visited his uncle twice since moving to Tennessee. Bernie was 81 now, a widower with no children, living out his final years in the nursing home. He had been an electrical engineer, brilliant and meticulous, spending most of his career at the old Riverside power plant before it shut down in the mid-1970s. Tom remembered Bernie as a kind man who used to build model trains and tell stories about the massive machines he worked with. But during the last visit, Bernie had seemed agitated, talking in circles about something that happened at the plant. Something that was never right, never resolved. Tom had assumed it was just old age and confusion. Now he was not so sure. The letter felt urgent. Tom planned to visit Bernie tomorrow morning. But tonight, as he walked with York through the forest, something strange was happening. Every time they came near the old plant, York became restless. The dog would stop, sniff the air intensely, and stare toward the ruins. It had been happening for weeks, but Tom had dismissed it as curiosity about wildlife or interesting scents. Tonight was different. York was not curious. He was alert, almost alarmed, behaving exactly as he did when he detected danger on patrol. Tom stood still, watching his dog. York turned his head to look at Tom, then back toward the plant, then back to Tom again. The message was clear. We need to check that place. Tom felt the old familiar tingle of adrenaline, the combat awareness returning. If York sensed something, then something was there. Tom drove to Crossville Memorial Care Facility early the next morning, York sitting alert in the passenger seat. The nursing home was a low brick building surrounded by neat lawns and flower beds that tried too hard to look cheerful. Inside, the smell of disinfectant and institutional food hung in the air. Tom signed in at the front desk and walked down the long corridor to room 247, York padding quietly beside him. The staff knew York from previous visits and understood he was a service dog. They found Uncle Bernie sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at nothing. The old man had lost weight since Tom last saw him. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the arms of the chair. But when Bernie turned and saw Tom, his watery blue eyes sharpened with recognition. And something else. Urgency. Tom pulled up a chair and sat close. Bernie reached out and gripped Tom's hand with surprising strength. For a long moment, the old man just looked at his nephew, as if deciding whether to speak. Then he began to talk, his voice low and rough. He spoke about the Riverside power plant, about the years he spent maintaining the massive turbines and electrical systems that powered half the county. He spoke about the men he worked with. Good men. Hard-working men. And then he spoke about David Reeves. David Reeves had been a maintenance supervisor at the plant, Bernie explained, a detail-oriented man in his 30s with a wife and 2 young daughters. In the spring of 1974, David started noticing irregularities in the plant's financial records. Equipment that was listed as purchased never arrived. Invoices for repairs that were never performed. Money was disappearing, significant amounts. And David suspected someone in management was stealing from the company. David had confided in Bernie, showing him copies of documents he had secretly made. The evidence pointed to Gerald Harmon, the plant director, a man with political connections and a reputation for ruthlessness. David planned to report everything to state authorities. Bernie had warned him to be careful, but David was determined. He said he had a moral obligation to expose the corruption. Then, one night in late April 1974, David Reeves vanished. He had been working the night shift. His car was found in the parking lot the next morning, keys still in the ignition, his lunch pail sitting on the front seat. No signs of struggle. No note. Nothing. The official investigation concluded that David must have wandered off, perhaps had an accident in the surrounding woods, or drowned in the nearby river. His body was never found. The case went cold within months, but Bernie never believed the official story. He knew David would never abandon his family. He suspected foul play, suspected that Gerald Harmon had something to do with the disappearance, but he had no proof. Bernie had kept quiet out of fear for his own safety. Gerald Harmon died 15 years ago, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. But his son, Victor Harmon, still lived in Crossville. Bernie's voice dropped to a whisper. He told Tom that he had been haunted by his silence for 50 years. haunted by the thought that David Reeves might have been murdered and buried somewhere on the plant grounds, his family never knowing the truth. Now, with death approaching, Bernie wanted the truth uncovered. He looked into Tom's eyes and asked him to investigate, to find out what really happened to David Reeves, to bring peace to a family that had suffered for decades without answers. Tom left the nursing home with a heavy sense of responsibility. He drove slowly through town, thinking about what Bernie had told him. York sat beside him, occasionally glancing at Tom as if sensing his troubled thoughts. Tom decided he needed more information before doing anything rash. He stopped at the office of Dr. Nina Caldwell, the local veterinarian who had been treating York since Tom moved to the area. Nina was in her late 40s, a competent and compassionate woman with short gray hair and kind eyes. She had served as an Army veterinarian years ago and understood the special bond between veterans and their service dogs. She always took extra time with York, and she had been one of the few people in town who treated Tom with genuine respect rather than pity or suspicion. Tom found her in the clinic examining a hound dog with a bandaged paw. After she finished, Tom asked if they could talk privately. Nina led him to her small office at the back of the clinic and closed the door. Tom explained that he was curious about the old Riverside power plant and wondered what Nina knew about it. Nina leaned back in her chair and frowned. She told him the plant had been abandoned since the mid-70s and had become a local hazard. The structure was decaying, full of rusted machinery, unstable floors, and toxic materials like asbestos and old transformer oil. Over the years, there had been accidents. Teenagers trying to explore the place had fallen through rotten floors or cut themselves on jagged metal. One kid nearly died from tetanus after stepping on a rusty nail. The county had put up fences and warning signs, but they were mostly ignored. Nina also mentioned something that caught Tom's attention. In recent months, there had been reports of vehicles near the plant at odd hours, late at night or very early in the morning. Some locals suspected drug dealers were using the abandoned buildings as a meeting spot or storage area. Others thought it might be scrappers illegally salvaging metal and equipment to sell. Nina said she had seen Victor Harmon driving near the plant on more than one occasion, which struck her as strange since Vic owned a successful construction business and had no obvious reason to be poking around a dangerous ruin. Tom asked Nina what she knew about Vic Harmon. Nina chose her words carefully. She said Vic was a prominent figure in town, wealthy and well-connected, serving on the town council and sponsoring local events. He had a reputation for being shrewd in business, sometimes ruthless but nothing openly criminal. His construction company had won most of the major public contracts in the county over the past decade. People either respected him or were afraid to cross him. Nina admitted she did not trust Vic, something about the way he carried himself, but she had no concrete reasons for her suspicion. She warned Tom that the power plant was genuinely dangerous and urged him to be careful if he intended to go there. Tom thanked her for the information and promised he would not take unnecessary risks. As he left the clinic, York trotting beside him, Tom felt the familiar pull of a mission. This was something he could do, something that mattered. He would find out what happened to David Reeves. That evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, Tom and York approached the Riverside power plant on foot. Tom had parked his truck a half-mile away and hiked through the woods to avoid being seen. The plant loomed before them, a sprawling complex of crumbling concrete buildings, rusted towers, and massive cylindrical tanks covered in graffiti and vines. The main structure was 4 stories tall, with rows of shattered windows. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but sections had been cut open or knocked down over the years. Warning signs hung crookedly, faded and riddled with bullet holes. Tom slipped through a gap in the fence, York close at his heels. The ground was littered with broken glass, twisted metal, and chunks of concrete. They entered through a side door that hung off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rust, mold, and decay. The main turbine hall stretched before them, a vast shadowy space filled with enormous rusting machinery. Massive gears, some taller than a man, sat frozen in place, their teeth edged with corrosion. Pipes snaked along the walls and ceiling, many of them broken and leaking stagnant water. The floor was treacherous, covered in debris and slick with moisture. Thin beams of fading sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, creating ghostly columns of light in the gloom. Tom moved carefully, testing each step. York stayed close, his nose working constantly, cataloging the scents of this strange place. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water and the creak of metal settling. They explored the ground floor, finding old control rooms with rusted panels and shattered gauges, break rooms with overturned chairs and rotting tables, and storage areas filled with decaying cardboard boxes and rusted tools. Everything was coated in layers of dust and grime. But as they moved deeper into the plant, Tom began noticing things that did not fit the picture of total abandonment. In one hallway, the dust on the floor had been disturbed by recent footprints, multiple sets, made within the past few days. In a side room, he found fresh cigarette butts and an empty energy drink can. Most telling, in a storage bay near the loading dock, Tom discovered stacks of copper wire and aluminum pipes that had clearly been cut from other parts of the plant and organized for transport. Someone was actively salvaging valuable materials from this place. York suddenly tensed, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Tom froze and listened. He heard nothing at first, then faintly, the sound of a vehicle engine in the distance. Tom quickly moved to a broken window and peered out. Through the gathering darkness, he saw headlights approaching on an old service road that led to the plant. A pickup truck. Tom checked his watch. It was just after 8 in the evening. He pulled York back into the shadows and waited. The truck stopped near the loading dock. 2 men got out. Even in the dim light, Tom recognized one of them from photos he had seen around town. Victor Harmon. The other man was younger, heavily built, with a shaved head and a sleeve of tattoos on his left arm. They opened the truck bed and began loading it with the copper wire and aluminum pipes Tom had seen earlier. They worked quickly and efficiently, clearly practiced at this operation. Tom crouched in the darkness, watching and listening. Tom stayed perfectly still, one hand resting on York's neck to keep the dog calm and silent. York understood the command without words, his body tense but controlled, watching the men through the broken window. Tom could hear their voices now, carried on the cool night air. The tattooed man was complaining about the weight of the pipes, his voice rough and irritated. Victor Harmon told him to stop whining and move faster. They wanted to finish before anyone came by. The casual efficiency of their operation told Tom this was routine for them, not a one-time theft. They loaded the truck bed methodically, working for about 20 minutes until it was full. Then Vic pulled out his phone and made a call. Tom strained to hear. Vic spoke quietly, but fragments of the conversation drifted across the distance. He mentioned a delivery scheduled for tomorrow. Buyers coming from Knoxville, good money for clean copper. Then Vic said something that made Tom's pulse spike. The tattooed man asked if they should clear out the basement levels soon. Vic's response was sharp and tense. He said nobody goes down there, not yet. Not until they were sure the old man was gone and nobody else was asking questions. The tattooed man laughed and said something about the old man being half senile anyway. Who would believe him? Vic did not laugh. He said they needed to be careful, that there were things down in those lower levels that could ruin everything if discovered. They needed to wait a little longer, then they could seal it all up permanently. Tom's mind raced. Were they talking about Bernie? And what was down in the basement that Vic was so worried about? The 2 men finished loading, slammed the truck bed closed, and drove away into the darkness. Tom waited another 10 minutes to be certain they were gone before moving. He looked down at York, who was watching him intently. Tom made a decision. They needed to find a way down to the lower levels of this plant. If there was something hidden there, something connected to David Reeves's disappearance, Tom needed to see it. But not tonight. It was too dark, too dangerous to navigate unfamiliar underground passages without proper preparation. Tom and York made their way carefully back through the plant and out into the forest. As they walked back toward his truck, Tom's mind worked through what he had witnessed. Victor Harmon was clearly running an illegal salvage operation, stealing valuable metals from the abandoned plant. That alone was a crime, but not the one Tom was interested in. The conversation suggested something much darker, something Vic desperately wanted to keep hidden in the depths of the plant. Tom suspected it was connected to what happened 50 years ago. When Tom reached his truck and started driving home, he realized he needed help. He could not just break into the plant and start tearing through basement levels without risking arrest or worse. He needed official support. That meant going to the police. Tom drove into town and headed for the small sheriff's substation on Main Street. It was after 9 now, but he knew deputies worked night shifts. He parked outside and walked in with York. The deputy on duty was a young man, probably late 20s, with neat brown hair and a crisp uniform. His nameplate read, G. Sims. Deputy Garrett Sims looked up from his computer as Tom approached the desk. Tom introduced himself and explained that he wanted to report suspicious activity at the old Riverside power plant. Garrett listened politely as Tom described seeing Victor Harmon and another man loading salvaged metal into a truck late at night. The deputy's expression remained neutral, but Tom could see skepticism forming. Garrett asked Tom what he was doing at the plant in the first place. Tom explained about his Uncle Bernie, about the story of David Reeves's disappearance in 1974, and about his suspicion that there might be evidence still hidden in the plant's lower levels. As Tom spoke, Garrett's skepticism deepened. The deputy leaned back in his chair and sighed. He told Tom that the David Reeves case was ancient history, closed decades ago, with no evidence of foul play. As for Victor Harmon, Garrett said Vic actually had permission from the county to salvage certain materials from the plant as part of an eventual demolition project. It was all above board, contracted and legal. Tom felt frustration rising. He insisted that Vic's behavior seemed secretive and suspicious, that the conversation he overheard suggested something being hidden. Garrett's tone became firmer. He said that eavesdropping on private conversations and trespassing on county property were not legal either. He advised Tom to let the past stay buried and to stay away from the power plant for his own safety. The structure was dangerous, people had been hurt there, and the county was not responsible for injuries to trespassers. Garrett's message was clear. Drop it and go home. Tom left the sheriff's station feeling angry and dismissed. York walked beside him, sensing his handler's tension. Tom sat in his truck for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. He understood Garrett's position. From the deputy's perspective, Tom was just another veteran with too much time on his hands, chasing conspiracy theories and old ghost stories. But Tom knew what he had seen and heard. There was something wrong happening at that plant. And if the local police would not help, then he would have to investigate on his own. He drove home, his mind already forming a plan. Over the next 2 days, Tom prepared carefully. He gathered equipment, a powerful LED flashlight, spare batteries, a first aid kit, rope, gloves, a pry bar, and his old military knife. He studied satellite images of the power plant on his laptop, trying to identify possible entry points to the lower levels. He visited the local library and searched through old newspaper archives on microfiche, looking for anything related to David Reeves or the plant's history. He found a few articles from 1974 about the disappearance, but they contained nothing Bernie had not already told him. There was one interesting detail. The articles mentioned that David Reeves had been scheduled to meet with state auditors the week after he vanished. The meeting never happened. Tom also found an old staff photograph from the plant's final year of operation. He recognized Bernie's younger face in the back row. And there, standing in the center of the front row with a confident smile, was Gerald Harmon. Tom studied the man's face, trying to see guilt or cruelty there, but all he saw was a successful executive posing for a camera. On the third night, Tom returned to the Riverside power plant. This time he went in the early morning hours, around 2 a.m., when the chance of encountering Vic or his crew was lower. The moon was half full, providing enough light to navigate the forest without using his flashlight until necessary. Tom and York moved like ghosts through the trees, making no sound. They entered the plant through the same side entrance and made their way to the main turbine hall. Tom had studied the layout and believed the access to the basement levels would be near the rear of the building, where the fuel systems and cooling infrastructure were located. They moved carefully through the darkness, Tom using his flashlight sparingly, just brief flashes to check their path. York stayed close, his senses far sharper than Tom's in the darkness. The dog could detect dangers that Tom would never see until too late. After 15 minutes of careful navigation through the decaying complex, they found what Tom was looking for. A heavy metal door set into the floor at the far end of a side corridor, partially hidden under a collapsed section of ceiling panels. The door was old and rusted, but someone had recently cleared away some of the debris around it. Fresh scratches on the metal surface suggested it had been opened not long ago. Tom knelt beside the door and examined it. There was a heavy padlock, but the hasp it was attached to was so corroded that Tom was able to pry it off with his crowbar after a few minutes of effort. The screech of tearing metal seemed incredibly loud in the silence. Tom froze, listening, but heard nothing except the settling creaks of the old building. He pulled the door open. It was heavy, the hinges groaning in protest. Below was a metal staircase descending into absolute darkness. Tom clicked on his flashlight and shone it down the stairs. The beam revealed a narrow shaft dropping at least 20 feet, the stairs slick with moisture and streaked with rust. The air rising from below was cold and damp, carrying a faint chemical smell that made Tom's nose wrinkle. York leaned forward and sniffed the opening, then looked up at Tom. The dog's body language showed caution, but not alarm. Tom took a breath and started down, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. York followed immediately behind, his claws clicking softly on the metal treads. The descent felt endless, the darkness swallowing them. Tom's flashlight beam bounced off dripping concrete walls and corroded pipes. They reached the bottom and found themselves in a long corridor that stretched in both directions. The ceiling was low, barely 6.5 feet, crisscrossed with sagging pipes and thick bundles of electrical conduit. Water pooled on the concrete floor. The walls were stained with decades of seepage and mold. This was the plant's subterranean infrastructure, the guts of the operation where fuel, water, and waste had been managed. Tom chose to go left, moving slowly, sweeping his light across every surface. They passed through several chambers filled with massive rusted tanks, old valve assemblies, and machinery Tom could not identify. Everything was in an advanced state of decay. In some places, the corrosion was so severe that metal had crumbled into piles of orange powder. They had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when York suddenly stopped and growled low in his throat. Tom immediately stopped and killed his flashlight. In the sudden darkness, he listened. At first, nothing. Then he heard it. Voices, distant and echoing, coming from somewhere ahead. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he pressed himself against the cold concrete wall, one hand on York's collar to keep the dog still and silent. The voices grew slightly louder, echoing through the maze of underground corridors in a way that made it impossible to judge distance accurately. Tom could make out at least 2 distinct voices, both male, one of them sounding angry. He waited in the darkness, breathing slowly through his nose, using the skills he had learned in combat to control his fear and stay calm. York remained perfectly still beside him, a coiled spring ready to act on command. After a long minute, the voices began to fade, moving away from their position. Tom waited another 3 minutes before turning his flashlight back on, keeping the beam low and pointed at the ground. They continued forward, moving even more carefully now, knowing they were not alone down here. The corridor curved and branched into multiple passages. Tom tried to maintain a mental map, but quickly lost track in the labyrinth. They entered a larger chamber that must have been some kind of control room, filled with ancient electrical panels and switching equipment. Thick cables hung loose from overhead conduits like dead vines. Tom swept his light across the room and noticed something out of place. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed rack of equipment, was a steel door. Unlike everything else down here, this door showed signs of recent maintenance. The rust had been scraped away around the handle, and there was a newer padlock securing it. Someone definitely wanted to keep people out of whatever was behind that door. Tom approached the door cautiously, examining the lock. It was a heavy-duty model, not something he could easily break. But the door frame itself was old, the concrete around the anchor bolts crumbling. Tom wedged his pry bar into the gap between the door and frame, near the lock, and applied steady pressure. The concrete cracked and chunks fell away. After several minutes of careful work, the entire lock assembly tore free from the rotted frame. Tom pulled the door open slowly, expecting it to creak. But the hinges had been recently oiled and moved smoothly. The beam of his flashlight revealed a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. The space had been used for storage. Metal shelving units lined 2 walls, most of them empty or collapsed. But on one remaining intact shelf, Tom saw a collection of items that made his breath catch. There were old file boxes, their cardboard surfaces bloated with moisture and mold, but still intact enough to read the faded labels. Personnel records, financial audits, safety reports. Tom carefully pulled down one of the boxes and opened it. Inside were yellowed papers, some stuck together, others crumbling at the edges. He recognized forms and documents from the power plant's operational days. These were official records, things that should have been archived or destroyed decades ago. Why were they hidden down here? Tom set that box aside and reached for another. This one labeled Equipment Purchases 1973 or 1974. As he lifted it, something else caught his eye on the lower shelf, pushed far back against the wall. A leather-bound notebook, smaller than the file boxes, its cover dark with age and damp. Tom pulled out the notebook and opened it carefully. The pages were handwritten in blue ink, the script neat and precise. On the inside cover was a name written in block letters. David Reeves. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. This was it. This was David's personal log. Tom flipped through the pages, his flashlight beam revealing entry after entry dated from 1973 and early 1974. David had been documenting his work, but also his suspicions. The entries started innocuously enough, notes about maintenance schedules and equipment performance. But as Tom read further, the tone changed. David began writing about discrepancies he had noticed, invoices that did not match actual deliveries, purchase orders for equipment that never appeared in inventory, contractors being paid for work that was never completed. David had started his own investigation, quietly cross-referencing records, checking serial numbers, verifying shipments. The picture that emerged was clear and damning. Gerald Harmon had been systematically embezzling from the power plant for years, creating false expenses and pocketing the money. The amounts were staggering, easily over $1 million, a fortune in the early 1970s. David had compiled evidence, copies of documents that proved the fraud. The final entries in the notebook were dated late April 1974. David wrote that he had scheduled a meeting with state auditors and planned to hand over all his evidence. He knew it was dangerous. He wrote that Harmon had become suspicious and had confronted him, but David refused to back down. The last entry was dated April 23, 1974. David wrote that he was working the night shift and planned to retrieve his hidden copies of documents to prepare for the meeting. The entry ended mid-sentence, as if David had been interrupted. Tom stood in that cold, underground room, holding the notebook, and felt a wave of anger and sorrow wash over him. David Reeves had been a brave man trying to do the right thing, and it had cost him everything. Tom was certain now that David had been murdered, killed to silence him, and his body hidden somewhere in this vast, decaying complex. The notebook was evidence, proof of motive for murder, but it was 50 years old and implicated a man who was already dead. Gerald Harmon was beyond justice. But his son Victor knew about this. Vic was down here, protecting this secret, which meant Vic was complicit in covering up a murder. Tom carefully placed the notebook inside his jacket, zipping it securely. He needed to get out of here and figure out his next move. But as he turned to leave the room, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast, coming from the corridor they had entered through. And a voice, loud and commanding, echoing through the underground passages. It was Victor Harmon, and he was shouting orders to find whoever had broken through the door. Tom's mind raced. They had been discovered. Vic must have security cameras somewhere, or maybe the sound of Tom breaking through the doorframe had carried further than he thought. Either way, they were trapped. Tom looked at York, who was staring back at him with absolute focus, waiting for direction. Tom made a split-second decision. They could not go back the way they came. Vic and his men were blocking that route. They had to go deeper, find another way out. Tom and York moved quickly out of the storage room and down the opposite corridor, away from the approaching voices. Tom turned off his flashlight, relying on touch and York's superior night vision to navigate. Behind them, beams from multiple flashlights began sweeping through the darkness, and Tom could hear at least 3 different men calling out, their voices aggressive and searching. The corridor sloped downward, and the air grew colder. Tom's hand trailed along the damp wall as they moved through near total darkness. York pressed against his leg, guiding him around obstacles. They turned a corner, and Tom risked turning on his flashlight for just a second to get his bearings. The brief flash revealed they were in a tunnel now, no longer a finished corridor, but a rougher passage carved through rock. The ceiling was lower here, supported by old wooden beams that looked dangerously unstable. Tom heard water somewhere ahead, a rushing sound that suggested an underground stream. They kept moving. Behind them, the pursuit was getting closer. Tom could see the glow of flashlights reflecting off the walls, hear the footsteps and angry voices. Someone shouted that they had found fresh tracks. Tom pushed himself to move faster despite the darkness and treacherous footing. The tunnel began to twist and branch. Tom chose directions almost at random, just trying to put distance between them and their pursuers. York suddenly pulled to the left, tugging Tom toward a narrow side passage. Tom trusted the dog's instincts and followed. The passage was barely wide enough for Tom's shoulders, and he had to turn sideways to squeeze through, the rough stones scraping against his jacket. They emerged into a larger space, and Tom could hear water much louder now, almost directly beneath them. He turned on his flashlight and saw they were on a narrow ledge overlooking an underground river. The water was black and fast-moving, rushing through a natural channel worn into the bedrock over thousands of years. The ledge was only about 3 feet wide and ran along the edge of the water for 50 feet, before disappearing around a curve. There was no other visible way forward. Tom looked back. He could see lights in the passage behind them now, very close. York pressed forward along the ledge without hesitation. Tom followed, pressing his back against the rock wall, moving sideways, his boots finding precarious purchase on the uneven stone. The roar of the water below was deafening. About halfway along the ledge, Tom heard shouting very close behind. A flashlight beam suddenly illuminated the narrow passage they had come through. Tom froze, holding his breath. A figure squeezed through the opening and stepped onto the ledge. It was the heavily built tattooed man with shaved head Tom had seen loading the truck with Vic days earlier. The man's flashlight swept along the ledge and found Tom. For a moment they locked eyes across the distance. The tattooed man's face split into a vicious grin. He called back over his shoulder that he had found them, then started moving along the ledge toward Tom and York. The man was bigger than Tom, heavily muscled, and he moved with confidence. Tom had nowhere to go. Ahead, York had reached the end of the visible ledge and was investigating something, but Tom could not see what. Behind him, the tattooed man was closing the distance, and Tom could hear more men entering the chamber. The tattooed man spoke as he approached, his voice mocking and cruel. He called Tom an idiot for sticking his nose where it did not belong. He said Vic had tried to let Tom walk away, but now that Tom had found the old man's journal, There was only one way this could end. The man reached into his belt and pulled out a hunting knife with a thick blade. Tom's combat training kicked in. He assessed his position, his options, his assets. The ledge was narrow, limiting movement. The drop to the water was at least 15 feet, potentially fatal if the river was shallow or filled with rocks. York was ahead, out of immediate danger. Tom had his own knife, but he was not in a strong, tactical position. The tattooed man lunged forward, slashing with the knife in a wide arc meant to force Tom back toward the edge. Tom ducked under the blade and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, using his lower center of gravity and the confined space to his advantage. They grappled, both men straining for control. The tattooed man was strong, but Tom had fought for his life in worse situations. They struggled on the narrow ledge, inches from the drop. The man tried to bring his knife down, but Tom caught his wrist and held it. They were locked together, muscles trembling with effort. Then York entered the fight. The German Shepherd came charging back along the ledge and launched himself at the tattooed man, 70 pounds of trained aggression hitting him from the side. The man's eyes went wide with shock and pain as York's jaws clamped onto his knife arm. The man screamed and lost his balance. Tom released him and pulled back. The tattooed man teetered on the edge for a long moment, York still attached to his arm. Then both of them went over the side and plunged into the black water below. Tom's heart stopped. He rushed to the edge and looked down, his flashlight beam searching the churning water. He saw York surface almost immediately, swimming strongly toward the opposite bank. The dog made it to a rocky shelf and scrambled out of the water, shaking himself. The tattooed man was not so lucky. Tom caught a glimpse of him being swept downstream, tumbling in the current, and then he was gone around a bend. Tom felt a surge of relief that York was alive, but also grim acceptance of what had just happened. He had no time to dwell on it. More men were coming. Tom could see prominent construction businessman Victor Harmon himself, now squeezing through the narrow passage onto the ledge, followed by two others. Vic's face was twisted with rage. He shouted at Tom, demanding the notebook, saying that Tom had just killed a man and would spend the rest of his life in prison unless he handed over the evidence and walked away. Tom shouted back across the rushing water, telling Vic that it was over, that the truth about David Reeves would come out, and that Vic would be the one going to prison for covering up his father's crimes. Vic's response was cold and final. He pulled a pistol from his jacket and aimed it at Tom. Vic said nobody would ever find Tom's body down here, just like nobody ever found David's. The old plant had swallowed one inconvenient man, and it would swallow another. Tom dove to the side as Vic fired. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, echoing like thunder. The bullet struck the rock wall where Tom had been standing, spraying chips of stone. Tom scrambled along the ledge as Vic fired again, this shot going wide. Tom reached the point where York had been investigating and saw what the dog had found. A gap in the rock wall, a natural crevice wide enough to slip through. Tom could hear water on the other side, a different sound, more echo, suggesting a larger chamber. It was a desperate gamble, but Tom had no choice. He squeezed through the gap as another bullet ricocheted off the stone behind him. Tom found himself in a large natural cavern, a limestone cave carved by water over eons. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, and the floor was uneven and treacherous. A shallow stream ran through the center of the cavern, probably fed by the river in the adjacent chamber. Tom's flashlight revealed multiple passages leading out of the cavern in different directions. Behind him, he could hear Vic and his men trying to follow through the narrow gap. Tom ran across the cavern, splashing through the stream, and chose the largest passage, hoping it would lead upward and eventually to the surface. York was somewhere ahead, having crossed the river. Tom called out to him, his voice echoing strangely in the cave. He heard a bark in response, distant but clear, coming from the passage he had chosen. Tom ran toward the sound, his boots slipping on wet stone, his lungs burning. The passage twisted and climbed, forcing Tom to use his hands to scramble up steep sections. Behind him, he could hear his pursuers entering the cavern, their shouts and flashlight beams creating a chaotic strobe effect. Tom kept climbing. The passage narrowed again, becoming a tight squeeze that scraped his shoulders and back. For a terrifying moment, Tom thought he was stuck, wedged between unyielding stone, but he exhaled completely and pulled himself through. On the other side, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, and there was York, waiting for him, wet and panting, but unharmed. Tom felt overwhelming gratitude and relief. He embraced the dog briefly. Then they kept moving. This chamber had a higher ceiling, and Tom could feel air moving, fresh air, suggesting an opening to the surface somewhere above. They found a steep chimney-like shaft with rough walls that offered handholds and footholds. Tom began climbing, his muscles screaming with fatigue. York could not follow this route, but the dog found a parallel crack in the rock and began scrambling up alongside Tom, his claws finding purchase on the stone. It was agonizing work. Tom's shoulders throbbed from the earlier fight. His hands were scraped and bleeding, and every breath felt like fire in his chest. But he climbed. Below, he could hear Vic and his men reaching the chamber, their flashlights illuminating the space. Someone fired a shot that spanged off the rock near Tom's foot. Tom climbed faster, ignoring the pain and fear. After what felt like an eternity, Tom's hand reached up and found open space. He pulled himself up and out through a narrow opening and collapsed onto cold ground. He was outside. The sky above was still dark, stars visible through a canopy of trees. Tom gulped in fresh air and looked around. York emerged from a nearby crevice, having found his own way out. They were in a small clearing on a hillside, surrounded by forest. Tom could hear shouts echoing from the cave opening behind him. Vic and his men would be emerging any moment. Tom forced himself to his feet. He and York had to run. They plunged into the forest, crashing through underbrush, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers. Tom had no idea which direction they were going, only that they needed to get far away and find help. They ran for what might have been 20 minutes, Tom's sense of time distorted by adrenaline and exhaustion. The forest began to thin, and Tom saw lights ahead. They emerged onto a narrow paved road. Tom recognized it as Highway 68, one of the rural routes that circled around Crossville. He stood in the middle of the road, gasping for breath, York beside him. Headlights appeared around a curve. Tom stepped into the lights, waving his arms. The vehicle, a small SUV, slowed and stopped. The driver's side window rolled down, and Tom saw competent veterinarian Nina Caldwell's concerned face looking out at him. She took in his appearance, muddy, bleeding, wild-eyed, and immediately asked what had happened. Tom leaned against her car, struggling to catch his breath. He managed to tell her that he needed help, that he had been attacked at the power plant, that prominent construction businessman Victor Harmon had tried to kill him, and that he had evidence of a 50-year-old murder. Nina's eyes widened, but she did not waste time with questions. She told Tom to get in the car, opened the back door for York, and pulled out her phone. As she drove quickly toward town, Nina called young Deputy Garrett Sims and reported an emergency, telling him that Tom Grant had been assaulted and that he needed immediate assistance at the sheriff's office. Tom sat in the passenger seat, shivering despite the car's heat, clutching the notebook inside his jacket. Nina glanced at him repeatedly, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. She asked if he was seriously injured. Tom shook his head. He was bruised, scraped, and exhausted, but nothing was broken. York leaned forward from the back seat and pressed his head against Tom's shoulder. Tom reached back and stroked the dog's head, drawing comfort from his presence. They had survived. Barely, but they had survived. And now the truth was going to come out. Nina drove directly to the sheriff's substation and pulled into the parking lot. Young Deputy Garrett Sims was already outside, standing under the entrance light with another older deputy. Garrett's expression was skeptical and irritated as Tom climbed out of Nina's car. But that changed when he got a good look at Tom's condition. Tom was covered in mud and grime, his jacket torn, his face scratched and bloody, and his hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Garrett's demeanor shifted to professional concern. He asked Tom what happened. Tom, speaking slowly to keep his voice steady, told the whole story. He explained going into the power plant's underground levels, finding David Reeves's notebook with evidence of embezzlement and murder, being discovered by Victor Harmon and his men, being chased through the tunnels, the fight on the ledge where the tattooed man fell into the underground river, Vic shooting at him, and the desperate escape through the cave system. Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each sentence. When Tom finished, he pulled the leather notebook from inside his jacket and handed it to Garrett. The deputy carefully opened it, shining his flashlight on the pages, reading several entries. The older deputy moved closer to look as well. After a long moment, Garrett looked up at Tom with a completely different expression. He believed him. Garrett immediately radioed for backup and for the county sheriff to be notified. He asked Tom if he needed medical attention. Tom said he was fine. He just needed to sit down. Nina guided Tom inside the station and sat him in a chair, bringing him water. York lay down at Tom's feet, finally relaxing. Over the next hour, the small sheriff's station became a hub of activity. The county sheriff, a stern woman in her 50s named Patricia Kowalski, arrived and took personal command. She interviewed Tom in detail, recording everything. She examined David Reeves's notebook, handling it carefully as evidence. She dispatched deputies and state police to the Riverside power plant with orders to secure the entire site and locate Victor Harmon. Search and rescue teams were called in to explore the underground river system to look for the body of the heavily built tattooed man, who Tom learned was named Franklin Cole, a known associate of Vic Harmon with a criminal record for assault. Sheriff Kowalski told Tom that he had done something remarkable and dangerous, and while she was not happy about him trespassing and conducting his own investigation, the evidence he had uncovered was potentially explosive. If the notebook's contents were verified, it would reopen a cold case and possibly lead to charges against Victor Harmon for obstruction of justice and accessory, after the fact, to murder. As dawn began to break outside, word came over the radio. State police had found prominent construction businessman Victor Harmon attempting to flee the area in his truck. He had been pulled over and arrested without incident. 2 other men were found with him, both employees of his construction company. All 3 were being held pending investigation. Sheriff Kowalski allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She thanked Tom for his persistence and courage. She said that justice had been delayed for 50 years, but it would finally be served. Tom felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. It was finally over. Tom spent the next 2 days recovering at home under Nina's watchful care. She insisted on checking on him multiple times each day, bringing food and making sure his cuts and bruises were healing properly. Tom's body ached everywhere, a deep soreness that reminded him of his worst days in combat. But his mind felt clearer than it had in years. He had accomplished something meaningful, something that mattered beyond himself. York stayed close, as always, seeming to understand that their mission was complete. And now was time to rest. The dog slept more than usual, curled up on the rug beside Tom's chair, occasionally lifting his head to check on his handler before settling back down. On the morning of the 3rd day, Tom received a call from the county sheriff. Patricia Kowalski asked if he felt well enough to come to the sheriff's office for an update. Tom said he would be there within the hour. He showered, dressed in clean clothes, and drove into town with York. At the sheriff's office, Kowalski welcomed him warmly and led him to a conference room where several other people were already gathered. Tom recognized young Deputy Garrett Sims, who nodded respectfully. There was also a woman in her 60s with silver hair and red-rimmed eyes, a man about Tom's age in a suit, and an older man in a wheelchair. Kowalski introduced them. The woman was Margaret Reeves Palmer, David Reeves's younger daughter, now a retired schoolteacher living in Knoxville. The man in the suit was her brother, James Reeves, an attorney from Nashville. The man in the wheelchair was Tom's uncle, Bernard Grant, who the sheriff had arranged to bring from the care facility for this meeting. Sheriff Kowalski explained that the investigation had moved quickly over the past 72 hours. David Reeves's notebook had been authenticated by handwriting experts and corroborated by archived financial records that state investigators pulled from storage. The embezzlement scheme documented by David was real, and the amounts matched discrepancies that had been noted but never fully investigated at the time the plant closed. More significantly, search teams had discovered human remains in a sealed chamber in the deepest level of the power plant's underground system, a space that had been deliberately concealed behind a false wall of concrete blocks. The remains had been sent for forensic analysis, but based on the location, clothing fragments, and a corroded wallet found with the body containing David Reeves's driver's license, investigators were confident they had found David. Margaret Reeves Palmer began to cry softly. Her brother put his arm around her shoulders. She looked across the table at Tom with tears streaming down her face and thanked him. She said that for 51 years, her family had lived with not knowing, with wondering if their father had abandoned them or met with some terrible fate. The not knowing had been a wound that never healed. Now, finally, they had answers. They could bring David home and lay him to rest properly. They could have closure. Margaret reached across the table and took Tom's hand, squeezing it tightly. She said Tom had given her family an incredible gift. Uncle Bernie spoke next, his voice weak but steady. He said he had carried the guilt of his silence for half a century, afraid to speak up, afraid of what might happen to him if he pushed too hard against powerful men. He had been a coward when David needed someone to stand with him. But Tom had been brave where Bernie had failed. Tom had honored David's memory and brought truth to light. Bernie's eyes were wet as he looked at his nephew. He said he was proud of Tom, prouder than he could express, and that whatever time he had left would be easier, knowing that this terrible wrong had finally been made right. Tom felt his own throat tighten with emotion. He told Bernie that none of this was his fault, that powerful men who were willing to kill would have destroyed Bernie too if he had spoken out back then. What mattered was that the truth was known now. Sheriff Kowalski continued the briefing. Victor Harmon had been formally charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal a homicide, and attempted murder of Tom Grant. Franklin Cole's body had been recovered from the underground river system. He had drowned, and while his death was being investigated, preliminary findings suggested it was the result of his own aggressive actions in pursuing and attacking Tom. The two other men arrested with Vic had been released after cooperating with investigators, providing statements about Vic's activities and admitting to the illegal salvage operation. Vic was in county jail being held without bond, facing decades in prison. More details emerged as Kowalski spoke. After ruthless plant director Gerald Harmon murdered David Reeves in 1974, likely by striking him during a confrontation and then hiding the body in the underground chambers, Gerald had orchestrated the cover-up and false investigation that concluded David had simply vanished. Gerald's position of power and his connections had made it easy to control the narrative. When Gerald died in 2010, his son Victor discovered the truth, either through his father's deathbed confession or through documents hidden among the family papers. Rather than come forward, Vic chose to protect his father's legacy and his own inheritance by ensuring the secret stayed buried. When Vic began salvaging valuable materials from the abandoned plant, he was careful to keep people away from the deepest levels where David's body was hidden. But when Uncle Bernie started talking to Tom, and when Tom began investigating, Vic panicked. He tried to intimidate Tom into backing off, and when that failed, he decided Tom had to be eliminated just as David had been. It was a pattern of violence and cover-up spanning 2 generations. Attorney James Reeves spoke up. He said his family intended to file a civil lawsuit against the Harmon estate, seeking damages for the wrongful death of his father and the decades of suffering inflicted on the family. He expected the case would be substantial, likely resulting in the forfeiture of much of the Harmon family wealth. He also thanked Tom and said that if there was anything the Reeves family could do for him, they would be honored to help. Tom shook his head and said he needed nothing. Seeing justice done was enough. The meeting concluded with Sheriff Kowalski informing everyone that the formal investigation would continue for several more weeks, but the primary facts of the case were established. There would be a trial, likely within the year, and Tom would be called to testify. Tom said he would be there. As people began to leave, Uncle Bernie asked Tom to wheel him outside. Tom pushed the wheelchair out into the cool autumn air. They sat together in silence for a while. watching leaves fall from the trees lining the street. Bernie finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said that Tom had saved him, not just by uncovering the truth, but by giving him peace before he died. Bernie knew his time was short, maybe weeks, maybe just days. But he would die without that crushing weight of guilt and fear that had followed him for so long. He could face whatever came next, with a clean conscience. Tom knelt beside the wheelchair so he could look his uncle in the eye. He told Bernie that he loved him, that he was grateful for everything Bernie had done for him over the years, and that Bernie could rest easy now. The two men embraced, and Tom felt the frail body of his uncle trembling. York, who had been sitting patiently nearby, walked over and laid his head on Bernie's lap. The old man smiled and stroked the dog's fur. Bernie said that York was a true hero, that the dog had protected Tom and helped bring justice to a man who died alone and forgotten. Bernie believed that David Reeves's spirit could rest now, and maybe in some way, David knew that a veteran and his loyal dog had fought for him when no one else would. Tom drove Bernie back to the care facility and helped him settle into his room. As Tom prepared to leave, Bernie grasped his hand one more time and made Tom promise to keep fighting for what was right, to use the strength and courage he possessed to help people who could not help themselves. Tom promised. He kissed his uncle's forehead and walked out, knowing in his heart that this would likely be the last time he saw Bernie alive. That knowledge was painful, but it was also peaceful. They had said what needed to be said. 2 weeks later, Bernard Grant passed away quietly in his sleep. Tom arranged a small funeral. Margaret and James Reeves attended, along with Nina Caldwell, young Deputy Garrett Sims, and a handful of other townspeople who had known Bernie over the years. Tom delivered a brief eulogy, speaking about his uncle's kindness, his brilliance as an engineer, and his ultimate courage in entrusting Tom with the truth. Bernie was laid to rest in the Crossville Cemetery under a simple headstone. Tom stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, York sitting beside him, and said a final silent goodbye. Life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Tom found that he no longer felt the crushing isolation and purposelessness that had defined his existence before. People in town treated him differently now, with respect and even admiration. He was no longer just the troubled veteran living alone in the woods. He was the man who had brought justice for David Reeves, who had stood up to corruption and violence, who had risked his life for the truth. Nina Caldwell became a regular presence in Tom's life. She would stop by his cabin for coffee, invite him to community events, and check in on him with genuine care. A friendship deepened between them, built on mutual respect and understanding. Nina had seen combat in her own way during her military service, and she understood the scars that service could leave. She never pushed Tom, never demanded more than he was ready to give, but she was there, steady and kind. Tom began to open up in ways he had not been able to before. He talked about his experiences, about the friends he had lost, about the guilt and anger he carried. Nina listened without judgment. York, of course, remained the center of Tom's world. The dog had proven once again that he was more than a pet, more even than a service animal. York was a partner, a protector, and a brother. Tom could not imagine his life without the German Shepherd. He made sure York received the best care, the finest food, regular vet checkups with Nina, and all the love and attention the dog deserved. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch of the cabin, looking out over the mountains, and Tom would talk to York about the day, about his thoughts and feelings, and York would listen with those intelligent eyes, understanding in ways that transcended words. Several months after the investigation concluded, the town of Crossville held a special ceremony. It was organized by the Reeves family and supported by the county government. The ceremony honored David Reeves, recognizing him posthumously as a whistleblower who had died fighting corruption, and also honored Tom Grant and York for their courage in bringing the truth to light. The event was held in the town square on a bright Saturday morning. A memorial plaque for David was unveiled, installed on a stone monument near the courthouse. Margaret and James Reeves spoke, their voices strong with emotion and gratitude. Then Sheriff Kowalski called Tom and York to the front. She presented Tom with a civilian commendation from the county for his bravery and service to justice. The crowd applauded. Then, in a gesture that took Tom completely by surprise, Kowalski knelt down and placed a medal around York's neck, a specially commissioned award recognizing the dog as a hero. The medal was engraved with York's name and the words, "Courage, Loyalty, Service." The crowd erupted in cheers. York sat perfectly still, dignified and calm, as if he understood the significance of the moment. Tom looked down at his dog, at the medal gleaming against the dark fur, and felt his vision blur with tears. This dog had saved his life in war and saved his soul in peace. York had been there through every dark moment, every battle, every fear. He had never wavered, never abandoned Tom, never stopped fighting beside him. After the ceremony, people came up to Tom to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories. Tom realized that he was no longer alone. He was part of a community. He had connections, relationships, purpose. The mission to find out what happened to David Reeves had given Tom something he desperately needed, a reason to keep going, a way to use his skills and experience for good. And now, standing in the town square with York beside him and people all around offering their respect and friendship, Tom understood something profound. He had spent years believing that his war was over, that he had nothing left to fight for, but he had been wrong. The battles worth fighting were not always on distant battlefields. Sometimes they were right here at home, in small towns where injustice had been buried and forgotten, where families suffered without answers, where truth needed a champion. Tom looked down at York, who was patiently enduring the attention of children who wanted to pet the hero dog. Tom smiled. He reached down and ruffled York's ears. He said quietly, so only the dog could hear, that they made a good team, that they always had, and that whatever came next, they would face it together. York looked up at him with those steady, intelligent eyes, and Tom saw in them the same absolute loyalty and trust that had carried them through every trial. Tom thought about something his old sergeant used to say during his military service. The sergeant would tell the new soldiers that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right, even when you were terrified. Loyalty was not just standing beside someone when things were easy, but refusing to leave when everything fell apart. Tom had seen that truth proven over and over in combat, and he had seen it proven again in the past months. York embodied those principles absolutely. The dog had never hesitated, never calculated the risk to himself, never considered running when things got dangerous. York had simply done what needed to be done because Tom needed him. That was loyalty in its purest form. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, retired schoolteacher Margaret Reeves approached Tom one more time. She was holding a small wooden box. She opened it and showed Tom what was inside. It was her father's watch, a simple steel timepiece that David had worn every day. Margaret said the watch had been with her father's remains, remarkably still intact after all these years underground. She wanted Tom to have it. Tom tried to protest, saying it should stay with the family, but Margaret insisted. She said that Tom had fought for her father when no one else would, that he had given David a voice after 50 years of silence. She wanted Tom to carry something of David's, to remember that what he did mattered, that he had changed lives and brought healing. Tom accepted the watch with deep gratitude, feeling the weight of it in his palm, understanding the profound trust being placed in him. Tom and York left the ceremony and drove back to their cabin in the mountains. The afternoon sun was warm, and the forest was alive with the sounds of late spring. Birds singing, insects humming, a breeze rustling through the pines. Tom let York out of the truck, and they walked together along their familiar trail. Tom wore David Reeves's watch on his wrist now, feeling its presence as a reminder. He thought about all that had happened, about the journey from isolation and despair to purpose and connection. He realized that his war had not ended when he left the military. It had simply changed form. There were still battles to fight, but they were different kinds of battles. Battles for justice, for truth, for people who had no voice, and he was not fighting alone. He had York, the most loyal companion any warrior could ask for. He had friends like Nina. He had a community that now knew his name and respected what he stood for. Tom stopped walking and sat down on a fallen log. York immediately came and sat beside him, leaning his weight against Tom's leg. Tom stroked the dog's head slowly, rhythmically, finding peace in the simple connection. He spoke aloud, his voice carrying into the quiet forest. He said that sometimes the greatest battles are fought by those who never asked for recognition, but who stand beside us without question. Loyalty is not just about being there in the good times. It is about standing firm when everything falls apart. It is about refusing to give up on someone, even when the world has. That is what York had done for him. That is what Tom had done for David Reeves and his family. And that is what he would continue to do, for as long as he had strength left. Tom looked at York and asked the dog if he wanted to hear something funny. He said that people kept calling York a hero. And while that was absolutely true, York probably did not care about medals or ceremonies or recognition. York cared about being with Tom, about doing the work, about staying loyal to the pack. That was what made him a hero, not the desire for glory, but the simple, unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Tom's tail thumped twice against the ground, as if in agreement. Tom laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine warmth. He realized he was happy. Not the manic happiness of someone trying to convince themselves everything was fine, but the deep, quiet happiness of someone who had found their place in the world. Tom stood up and looked down at his dog. He said they should head back to the cabin because it was almost dinner time, and he was pretty sure there was a steak in the freezer with York's name on it. The dog's ears perked up immediately, and he trotted ahead on the trail, looking back to make sure Tom was following. Tom smiled and walked after him, feeling lighter than he had in years. The mountains rose around them, ancient and steady. And the path home was clear. If you have someone in your life who stands by you through the hardest times, maybe a loyal dog, a true friend, or a family member who never gave up on you, share your story in the comments below. Those bonds matter more than we often realize. And if stories like this one remind you why loyalty and courage are worth celebrating, please subscribe to the channel so you can continue following these journeys of honor and redemption. There is another story waiting for you on your screen right now about a bond that refused to break and a fight that had to be won. Click on it and keep these important stories alive. To all the veterans and their families, thank you for your service and sacrifice. Your battles do not end when you come home, and you deserve to know that your courage still matters. Tom Grant and York understood that truth, and they lived it every single day. If this story reminded you that loyalty never quits even when the world falls apart, drop a comment 51 to honor the 51 years David Reeves's family waited for truth and justice, and to celebrate every veteran and every faithful companion who refuses to leave someone behind.